Welcome back to Pop Goes the Stack, where we just don't track emerging tech, we test its failover plans because it's always DNS, right, Joel?
That's exactly correct.
That's right. I am Lori MacVittie, your snarky sysadmin for today and most of the future. And we are here because we've all got the BOLA blues. Why? Because we read the 2025 API threat report, and shocker, we're still getting wrecked by injection, data leaks, and BOLA. All right. So what's BOLA? It's broken object level authorization. And 95% of attacks are coming through that these days. So translation, the bad guys aren't breaking in through the side door. They're waltzing in with a valid badge and looting the place. Okay. Bad stuff. BOLA's been at the top of the OWASP top 10 for apps, APIs, and soon probably AI too, for like the last 6 years. It's like 2019. It likes to switch with SQLI, but BOLA is big. And so we brought Garland Moore. Welcome, Garland.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Awesome. To talk to us about BOLA, what's going on, some real life examples maybe, and even some advice on how to stop it, because it's a real problem. So let's kick it off. What the heck? What's really BOLA? What's really going on?
Yeah. Thanks. Like I said again, thanks for having me. BOLA is one of those things that it's on the OWASP top 10 for a reason, right? It's number one on the top 10, and the reason being is because it's the most common, but also the most impactful vulnerability when it comes to APIs, right? So when you think about this concept, one of the misconceptions that we commonly run into is most people think that, oh, I have authentication, so I'm good. But authentication and authorization are two different things. So when you commonly think about, okay, I've got authentication within my app, but the authorization piece is commonly missing. So, and that's one of the reasons why it's highly targeted, right? Because those two things get construed all the time, and they really need to be separated.
Yeah. So let's kind of walk through a BOLA attack, and kind of provide an example. Let's look at an API surface. So say I'm a logged in user and I'm accessing an API endpoint and I'm checking my account. And so I would issue a GET request to the API account / and then a given account number, right? And my account number and my authentication may suggest that I have access to that account. But if I'm not doing a secondary authorization check to see if my account number and my authentication are the same and authorizing me into something, then I can simply change my account from 12345 to 12346 and then see the next account over. Is that how that attack occurs?
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly what happens. And what can happen in that instance is, as a user, I now have access to data that maybe I shouldn't be able to see, right? The API didn't check to see, hey, was I allowed to access that information? Or, was that user string that I put actually tied to the person who was authenticated to the application? So yeah, absolutely a huge problem there.
It sounds like there's two pieces to this. On the authorization side, I mean, assuming we all get authenticated, we have to log in and do all the, here's your security code and check your email, and it annoys us, but that makes sure we are who we say we are. We have authentication. I am an identity. Wonderful. But then you have that authorization piece. And it sounds like there's more than just, right? Authorization is, who are you and do you have access to that object, not just any account, but all, this particular account. Like there's a level of authorization of policy that may not be in place, as well as just a failure to check it. Because if the policy says, oh, they have access to accounts, then it's still broken, right?
Right. Exactly.
Lori, this seems to me to be something that a developer assumes is true, but fails to check. A developer might assume, for example, that an authenticated user is authorized and fail to check whether they are or not. So at the point in time when they're supposed to be allowed access to their account and their account alone, the assumption the developer makes is an authenticated user is also authorized to that account. And it skips past the secondary check. So, I think one of the solutions to this is to simply think about this in zero trust terms.
Yeah, but zero trust doesn't say shift everything left and say, well, it's a developer problem. And we've been
Yeah,
doing that forever. Like, just shift it
sure.
left. The developer should check. But maybe the developer did make an authorization call. Are they authorized? And the policy or some other mechanism on the back end is not correct, that it is actually allowing access at a broader level, right? Least privilege, I guess, zero trust, is not being applied correctly there.
Yeah. Now you're not going to get an argument from me. The developers bear a lot of the responsibility for this. I think where we may disagree slightly is to what the solution set actually is here. Whether you can solve this using shift left mechanisms, or whether you need to provide other security mechanisms. And what I'm going to say to that is, you're going to need both. Yes, you can count on shift left techniques to do this. Validation of authorization. The selection of secure frameworks rather than trying to craft your own is a good step that a developer can take. So instead of trying to craft an authorization structure on their own, choose one of the popular authorization toolkits that are out there that have this built in and do those checks on every API call. Now, you also want to protect yourself for when someone slips outside of those boundaries from the development perspective. So I also think you need other tools like API gateway or API security policy or API security tools. And you need a good way to determine whether this condition is affecting you. But no, I think that the developer has a lot of responsibility here, and they must.
I agree. They have responsibility. I just don't think the answer to everything, and it has been for a while, is just shift it left, just dump it on a developer, and that obviously is not solving the problem. And you know what? Garland is an actual solution architect, so solution architect, who's right? Are we both right? Are we both wrong? What's going on here, right? How do you really solve this problem so that it
Yeah,
isn't a
so
problem?
I'm gonna play it safe and say that you both are right.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Which I think
This
is
kind of guest we like.
Uh,
I think it's actually true, but Joel, to your point, right? When you talk about enforcing authorization, especially when it comes to APIs, you really need to be doing that at the object level. So if you think about, APIs are everywhere, right? Mobile phones, apps, smart devices in your home, like all of these things are talking via APIs. So that's why it's so highly targeted, because it's a direct reference to objects, to where the data lives.
Right.
So when you talk about enforcing authorization, it really needs to be done at an object level, right? So making sure that user 123, that user ID actually matches the object that they're trying to retrieve, or that they're trying to make that GET request to. So that's usually one of the big things. I think you both said that in a different fashion, but and then also being able to centralize that authentication, right? Like, these APIs are everywhere, so how do we control that and not have these one-off or these ad hoc authorization logics built into the application, right? We need to be able to centralize those. And then, least privilege is not only common with APIs, but everything we do in technology. So
Right.
how do we enforce the policy to only allow user 123 to be able to do what they're supposed to do?
Right.
Can we blame the database? Because ultimately, this
Absolutely.
right.
Absolutely.
Okay. Hey. All
Absolutely.
right. Well, because we're talking about policies, but policies are just they're broader. They never go down to Lori has only access to this account number, right? It doesn't get that specific. So there's some mechanism in the architecture that actually has to translate policy into, well, in the database this object is at, right, so there's something going on here too, and maybe we're missing that piece of it. Like, we assume that developers can handle it in code, or policy and gateways,
Yeah.
and external mechanisms can enforce it, and we're ignoring that databases really weren't built to apply, right, I mean, right, value level,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
terrible.
So
yeah.
here's where I go back and say that this all happens as part of the developer convenience loop is what I tend to call it. Yeah, it's absolutely true that you put in a particular line or a field in a database and the field belongs to a particular user. It really should only be given to that particular user account. But
Mhm,
because of the way technology has just grown and matured, we usually break that linkage from the application to the database by choice because it's easier. So we log in from an application to a database using a service account. And that service account
mhm,
has no relationship with the data object that's being requested by the application. It's just an open access to the database. And then the developer is supposed to be the person ensuring that only the right fields make it from the database back through the application to the end user. So it's on the user, it's on the developer to do that authorization step. I'm of the opinion that we need to kind of get away from using service accounts for data access. I think that the time has come,
yeah, yeah,
especially in the era of zero trust, that we need to pass authorization requests all the way back to the database and field and object level, and stop using service accounts for things. I think that the level of difficulty that represents for the developer is really high. But the payback is instantaneous. You don't risk things like BOLA attacks if you authorize all the way down to the data resource.
and Joel, to that point, right, I think there are also things, so it is a little tougher, right, if you try to shift that left, but there are some things you can do, right? You can integrate things like API scanners into CI/CD processes. Um, but I do also agree. I was working on a project where the admin wanted to use a service account to retrieve and validate users' password. And I'm like, oh my God, no, we can't. Absolutely not. We will absolutely not do that, right? But it's easy and it gets them over the hump to getting things functional. But that's when we have issues like BOLA become
Exactly.
present. So
Yeah. Now,
wholeheartedly agree.
I should also point out that this sounds like a problem that might just affect an inexperienced developer developing a lightweight application, and they just miss a step. But BOLA attacks have actually been factors in data loss for very prominent public applications and websites in the past. In
Yeah.
2019, Instagram had a BOLA situation where tweaking user IDs and API calls allowed access to private photos in other accounts that the user should not have had access to. That is the classical BOLA situation, and it led to a pretty serious black eye on the part of that site. In 2021, Parler, one of the social networks, they used numeric post IDs that they incremented one by one, and they failed to
Hmm.
check authorization. And so it was very easy to step from a public article to a public article to several private ones, and just read everyone else's mail. And so things like this do happen, and they happen even in the larger development shops. I think it's important to realize that.
I'd love to put this off on, well, if people weren't bad and tried to do this in the first place, right? We wouldn't have to have these protections, right?
Yeah.
But we do because
Yeah.
people do that. Either they're curious or they're malicious, but people are going to do this. And now we're adding AI and agents, and there's been a lot of talk about non-human identity and such, but not a lot about this authorization side, and it's going to like be multiplied when you put a whole bunch of agents out there, because now you have not only my identity on behalf of, but their
Mhm.
identity. And then, right, so how do you deal with that? Any suggestions, Garland? What do you think?
Yeah, so I think so you brought up a good point I wanted to touch there. Like there it's so easy to be bad these days, right? Like I don't have to try hard to be bad,
No.
right?
No.
I can I can scour the internet, download some software, and off I go, right? So to that point, I think one thing, and Joel, you touched on this as well, is relying on URL format, right? So V1, oh now I retired V1, now I'm going to V2. So I just changed the URL V2. Well, that's not really a form of security,
Right.
right? Those scanners that I can get, they're going to scan all of those common URL patterns that just get changed with those old API endpoints out there. So to that point, one of those things is when you develop new APIs or different endpoints, then the old one needs to be decommissioned or retired. I think we see a lot of those things hanging out there over time. And just because we change the URL doesn't mean it doesn't still exist, but then we kind of ignore that endpoint, and that's where the vulnerabilities happen.
Right. Yeah, I can think of a few different solutions potentially for this, but I will be perfectly frank, Lori. A lot of them relate to the developer getting involved and being aware. And
Back
I know that that is
in,
a painful thing for
back
you to
in
hear, and
there.
it is kind of a painful thing for me to say
Mhm.
as someone who's developed software.
Oh, it didn't
But
sound that painful.
yeah, I mean, the developer has to be trained. They have to be trained better. They have to recognize that if I'm passing an
Yes.
object,
Mhm.
before I pass that object, the first thing that I should do is I should check to see whether there is an authorization to pass that object. It
Yes.
seems like
Mhm.
extra work, but it's not. It's not extra work. It's
Yeah.
actually adhering to a basic level of authorization control. I think in order to assist the developer, what they need to do is look for secure frameworks that have this secondary authorization check built in. I'm a particular fan of something called Open Policy Agent, where
Hmm.
the authorization step is actually externalized from the application, and so you can write and change authorization checks on objects dynamically. I think those technologies are incredibly powerful. And those frameworks are fairly easy to use and consume by developers because they don't require a lot of extra work. I think in terms of training developers, one thing we need to tell developers to do is stop using guessable object IDs.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
If you
yeah.
are creating an object ID and you are simply incrementing by one every time you create a new one, you have created a predictable sequence, and an attacker loves a predictable sequence because they just step up by one, and maybe there's new data there. So don't do that. Use things like generated UUIDs, right?
Hmm.
That have an element of I won't say randomness, but pseudo randomness.
At least.
I'm sensitive to the mathematics here,
Yeah. Okay.
but those are not inherently guessable, and have a mechanism for providing a little bit of security through obscurity. And like Garland said, develop tests. Test for this. Test for authorization failures within your pipeline as you are shifting left. Put the tests for these problems in your pipeline. But yeah, those are some
Yeah,
of the things that I
yeah.
can think of that are effective.
Mm.
Yeah, Joel, I was going to mention OPA. I like OPA a lot, especially when you talk about, we hear a lot about infrastructure as code, OPA, more policy as code. And then you also talked about randomizing, object IDs, which I think is key, right? Because a lot of
Mhm.
those free tools that make it easy for me to be bad, they just increment until they find something
That's
right.
right.
But I think another use case is to add contextual checks just beyond user ID, right? So you've got the role of the user, tenant IDs, and ownership, right? Through
Mhm.
like JOT tokens, right? So validating JOT claims can also help enforce, isolation within the authorization
Yeah.
flow.
Now, as you're building applications, I also think that it's not enough just to count on the developer to provide all of your security solutions for these API type attacks. You need to layer things. You need a layered defense, and so
Yeah. Yeah.
investing in things like a competently executed API gateway, perhaps one that has OPA support,
Hmm.
that is something that would provide significant value. Investing in a secondary or red teaming or vulnerability testing tools is another one. Investing in a well executed web application firewall is another way to prevent you from being susceptible to these attacks. But overarching all of this is, you know, there's a principle in security called least privilege. And least privilege is not about authentication at all. It's about authorization. And if you design everything for the principle of least privilege, you are always doing authentication, but you're always doing authorization steps as well. And thinking about the possibilities for least privilege holistically, doing things external to the application and doing things inside of the application according to that principle are going to protect you from BOLA attacks every day of the week.
Garland, do you agree with all that advice? If we're running up against time, so if you were to leave listeners with 3 things they can do to keep from being exploited by BOLA,
Yeah,
what
yeah,
would you
absolutely.
tell them?
So I do agree with all those things. And I think also one thing we have to mention here is the reason some of this happens is because we got to get the product out the door, right? So we're trying to get it done as quickly as possible to get to the end user, whatever the app is we're delivering. But I think we need to take just a tiny step back and think about these things before shipping it out the door. So, first thing I would say is just slow down a tad bit, right? And let's think about some of these things. Um, I do like OP, open policy agent that Joel mentioned, right? I think that's a kind of an underutilized concept. There's some other frameworks out there that can implement that, but it also can help you go faster, right? If you have a policy as code engine. I like the idea of not incrementing the UUIDs, right? You know, randomizing those. And then also validating access, right? Validating access, not just based on user ID, but the role and the ownership in validating job claims.
Awesome. Awesome. So what I'm hearing is security is everybody's responsibility and we all have a part to play, even developers. And so we all need to pay more attention in order to get BOLA, at least out of the top spot on the threat list, or, out of the top 10 if we can. So
Right.
let's all work toward that. But for now, that's all we have time for today. So that's a wrap. If you survived this deep dive, hey, subscribe. You'll need the practice for the next outage.